We often think of wars as being won by brave soldiers and brilliant generals on the battlefield. But what if I told you that one of the most decisive battles of World War II wasn't fought with guns, but with gasoline cans and truck tires? This is the incredible, often overlooked story of how logistics, the nitty-gritty of supply and demand, ultimately sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. After the successful D-Day landings in June 1944, a wave of optimism swept through the Allied forces. The beaches of Normandy were secure, and Paris was liberated just a few months later. It seemed like the road to Berlin was wide open, but the Allied commanders, men like Eisenhower and Bradley, knew a terrifying truth. Their victory in France was fragile, and it was hanging by a very, very thin thread. Imagine this. Nearly 90 Allied divisions, that's over 1 million soldiers, were now deep inside enemy territory. Every single one of them depended on a constant, unbroken chain of supplies streaming from the beaches they had just fought so hard to capture. We're talking about everything. The fuel for their tanks and trucks, the ammunition for their rifles and artillery, the food in their mess kits, even the spare parts to fix a broken-down Jeep. Without this lifeline, the most powerful army ever assembled would grind to a halt, becoming a sitting duck for a German counterattack. The German High Command knew this. They weren't just fighting the soldiers at the front. They were desperately trying to sever this logistical artery. The problem was immense. The initial plan had counted on capturing major French ports like Cherbourg and Antwerp quickly and intact. But the Germans were masters of destruction. When the Allies finally took Cherbourg, the port was so thoroughly demolished that it was practically useless. For weeks, every single bullet, every gallon of fuel, had to be unloaded directly onto the beaches of Normandy. A chaotic and inefficient process, especially as bad weather rolled in. This created a massive bottleneck. At the front, General Patton's Third Army was famously screaming for gasoline, his tanks literally running dry in the middle of their eastward blitz. It wasn't that the Allies didn't have the fuel, it was sitting in massive depots back in Normandy, hundreds of miles away. They simply couldn't get it to the front fast enough. The French railway system, which would have been the ideal solution, had been systematically bombed into oblivion by Allied air power before the invasion, a successful tactic that was now coming back to haunt them. Faced with a potential disaster that could stall the entire invasion, the Allies came up with a truly audacious solution. It was called the Red Ball Express. This wasn't a train, but a colossal, non-stop convoy of trucks running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on a one-way loop of roads specifically closed off to all other traffic. Think of it as a military superhighway, dedicated to one thing and one thing only: getting supplies to the front. The scale of this operation is hard to comprehend. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were constantly on the move, carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies every single day. The drivers, a majority of whom were African-American soldiers from segregated units, became the unsung heroes of the European campaign. They drove 4 days on end with little sleep, often under the threat of enemy aircraft and through towns still littered with snipers. They faced exhaustion, mechanical breakdowns, and constant danger, but they kept the trucks rolling. They were the lifeblood of the Allied advance. Without the Red Ball Express, the push into Germany in late 1944 would have been impossible. While the Allies were performing this logistical miracle, the Germans were facing a logistical nightmare of their own. From the very beginning of the war, Germany's entire military strategy was built on the concept of Blitz, or lightning war. This meant rapid, overwhelming attacks designed to win a war in a matter of weeks before their own limited resources ran out. It worked spectacularly in Poland and France. But when the war dragged on, especially on the vast Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, Germany's logistical weaknesses were brutally exposed. German industry was powerful, but it was never fully prepared for a long, drawn-out war of attrition. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, performed miracles in boosting production late in the war, but he was fighting a losing battle. Germany lacked critical raw materials, especially oil. Their synthetic fuel plants were a primary target for Allied bombers, and by 1944, Germany's fuel crisis was catastrophic. You can have the most advanced Tiger tank in the world, but without fuel, it's just a 60-ton steel coffin. There are countless reports of elite German panzer units being forced to abandon their perfectly good tanks simply because they ran out of gas. Furthermore, the relentless Allied bombing campaign wasn't just hitting factories. It was systematically dismantling Germany's transportation network. Bridges were dropped, railway marshalling yards were turned into craters, and canals were blocked. It became a daily struggle for the Germans to move troops, equipment, and even basic necessities like coal from one part of the country to another. A panzer division ordered to move from the Eastern Front to the west to counter the day-to invasion could take weeks to make the journey, constantly harassed from the air and delayed by destroyed rail lines. This contrast is stark. On one side, you have the Allies with their overwhelming industrial might, and the organizational genius of operations like the Red Ball Express, solving a supply crisis on the fly. On the other, you have the Germans with dwindling resources, a crumbling infrastructure, and a war machine that was slowly starving to death. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 is the perfect final example of this. Hitler's last great gamble in the West was a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. The plan was audacious, but its success depended entirely on one thing: speed. The German armored columns had to break through American lines and capture Allied fuel dumps before their own tanks ran dry. They were literally running on fumes from the start. Initially, the attack was a shocking success, but it didn't take long for the logistical realities to set in. The German supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and they failed to capture the fuel they so desperately needed. Meanwhile, once the weather cleared, Allied air power pounced on the exposed German columns, and the Allied logistical machine kicked into high gear to rush reinforcements to the front. The German offensive sputtered and died, not just from the heroic defensive towns like Bastogne, but from a simple lack of fuel and ammunition. They had shot their last bull. After the Battle of the Bulge, the German war machine was broken. The final push across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany in 1945 was still met with fanatical resistance in places, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German army was a hollow shell, unable to properly supply the men it still had at the front. So when we look back at the end of World War II in Europe, it's crucial to remember the whole picture. The bravery of the soldiers on the front lines was absolutely essential, but their courage would have meant nothing without the endless columns of trucks, the mountains of supplies on the beaches, and the thousands of unseen workers, drivers, and quartermasters who made it all possible. The war was won not just by the force of arms, but by the overwhelming power of logistics. It's a powerful lesson that a nation's ability to supply its army is just as important as the army itself. As the Allied forces surged across Europe, a sense of desperation began to grip the German high command. They saw the writing on the wall. The sheer industrial power of the United States was a tidal wave, a relentless force that threatened to overwhelm But what if that force could be stopped before it ever reached the battlefield? This was the core of Germany's desperate new strategy. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Orokedubel, formulated a plan that wasn't about winning head-on battles against overwhelming numbers. Instead, it was a strategy of strangulation. Their goal was to paralyze the Allied war machine by cutting its lifelines. The logic was brutal but simple. An American tank is a formidable weapon, but without fuel, it's just a tent and piece of steel. An infantry division is a powerful fighting force, but without ammunition, food, and medical supplies, it's just a group of vulnerable men. Germany believed that America's industrial strength was its greatest asset, but also its greatest vulnerability. If the endless stream of supplies pouring from American factories could be severed, then the Allied advance would grind to a halt. The tanks would run dry, the guns would fall silent, and the soldiers would starve. The entire invasion, reason it, would collapse under its own weight. So, the focus of the German war effort shifted. The Luftwaffe and long-range artillery were tasked with a singular, crucial mission: destroy the Allied supply chain. Every railway line became a target. Every bridge, a potential choke point. Every supply depot, a massive, explosive bullet. They aimed to create chaos in the Allied rear, to turn their logistical network into a smoldering ruin. Ports where thousands of tons of cargo were unloaded daily were especially high-priority targets. The ports of Antwerp and Cherbourg, vital arteries pumping lifeblood to the front, came under relentless attack. The Germans threw everything they had at them: bombers, V-1 flying bombs, and even the terrifying V-2 rockets. The plan was to create a logistical nightmare. Imagine a single railway line being blown up. That's not just a delay of a few hours. It means trains have to be rerouted, creating congestion on other lines. It means supplies meant for one sector now have to travel a longer, more complicated route. Now, multiply that disruption by 100. That was the German goal. They wanted to snarl the entire system to create such a backlog and state of confusion that the frontline troops would be left high and dry. They envisioned Allied commanders frantically trying to manage a situation where fuel was in one place, ammunition in another, and the troops who needed them were 100 miles away, with no way to get them. German intelligence worked overtime to identify the key nodes in the Allied supply network. They studied maps, intercepted communications, and analyzed reconnaissance photos to pinpoint the most critical junctions, depots, and transport hubs. The goal was surgical precision. Hitting a random stretch of track was inefficient, but destroying a major railway switching yard that could paralyze traffic for days, affecting dozens of divisions. Taking out a key bridge over a river could sever an entire supply route, forcing the Allies to undertake massive, time-consuming engineering projects to get things moving again. It was a war, fought not on the front lines, but on the maps of logistics. The attacks were relentless and varied. Luftwaffe sorties would sweep in at dawn, bombing marshalling yards and leaving a tangled mess of twisted steel. At night, lone bombers would hunt for the telltale lights of supply convoys on the roads. Sabotage teams were even parachuted behind enemy lines with orders to blow up bridges and disrupt communications. The V weapons, though inaccurate, were weapons of terror designed to disrupt the functioning of major port cities like Antwerp. The constant threat of attack was meant to wear down the morale of the logistics personnel and force the Allies to divert precious resources, like anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes, to defend their rear areas instead of supporting the front. For a time, the German strategy seemed to be working. The Allied advance did slow down in certain sectors. There were reports of units rationing fuel and ammunition. General Patton's famous Third Army, known for its lightning-fast advances, was at one point stalled. Not by German tanks, but by a lack of gasoline. This was exactly what the German High Command had hoped for. It seemed their strategy of logistical strangulation was bearing fruit. They had correctly identified the Achilles heel of the modern, mechanized Allied army. They had attacked it with precision and ferocity. From the German perspective, they were on the cusp of turning the tide. They believed they had found the solution to the problem of American industrial supremacy. But the Allies had a surprise of their own. They were not just a brute force of numbers and material. They were also a force of incredible ingenuity and organizational genius. They understood their own vulnerabilities better than the Germans did, and in response to the German campaign of destruction, they unleashed a logistical innovation that Germany, and indeed the world, had never anticipated. It was a solution so audacious and effective that it would not only counter the German strategy, but would also become one of the most legendary logistical feats in military history. This innovation was known as the Red Ball Express. It wasn't a secret weapon in the traditional sense. It wasn't a new tank or a faster plane. It was a system, a brilliantly organized, non-stop truck convoy system that operated on a massive scale. The concept was born out of necessity. With the railways under constant attack and the ports struggling to keep up, the Allies needed another way to get supplies to the front. They decided to turn the roads of France into a one-way superhighway for military trucks. A vast loop of roads was cordoned off for military use only. Civilian traffic was banned. One set of roads was designated for trucks heading to the front and another for trucks returning empty. This created a continuous, circular flow of traffic, minimizing delays and maximizing efficiency. The name Red Ball was a railroad term for priority freight, and this express route was the highest priority of all. For 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, convoys of trucks, spaced 60 yards apart and driving at a steady 35 miles per hour, rumbled towards the front lines. The scale of the Red Ball Express was staggering. At its peak, it involved nearly 6,000 trucks carrying over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front each day. The drivers were the heroes of this operation. The majority of them were African-American soldiers, who were often relegated to service and support roles at the time. They drove 4 days on end with little sleep, facing the constant threat of bad weather, mechanical breakdowns, and attacks from the lurking Luftwaffe. They were the lifeblood of the Allied advance. They patched their own tires, repaired their own engines, and kept the trucks rolling no matter what. The Red Ball Express completely bypassed the damaged railway network that the Germans had worked so hard to destroy. While the Germans were busy bombing rail junctions and bridges, thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food were simply driving around the problem. It was a flexible, decentralized system that was much harder to stop. You can bomb a bridge and halt 100 trains, but you can't bomb every truck on 1,000 miles of road. If one road was blocked, the convoys could simply be routed. The Germans had focused their strategy on fixed, static targets, and the Allies had responded with a solution that was fluid and dynamic. This logistical masterstroke completely nullified Germany's strategy. The flow of supplies to the front, which had briefly trickled, once again became a flood. Patton's tanks got their gasoline. The artillery got its shells. The infantry got their rations. The Allied war machine, which had sputtered for a moment, roared back to life, and the advance resumed its relentless pace. The German High Command watched in disbelief. They had correctly identified the problem the Allied supply line, but they had completely underestimated the Allied ability to solve it. Their plan to paralyze the enemy had failed. In the end, Germany's strategy to target supply lines was a sound military doctrine. It's a principle that's still taught in war colleges today, but it was defeated by something they never saw coming: the sheer logistical brilliance and adaptive problem-solving of the Allied forces, epitomized by the drivers of the Red Ball Express. They proved that while industrial might is crucial, it's the ingenuity and determination to get that might to the front that truly wins wars. The German plan was clever, but the Allied response was genius. Have you ever wondered how an army, thousands of miles from home, keeps its soldiers fed, armed, and ready to fight? It's a question of logistics, the unsung hero of every military victory. In the summer of 1944, this question became critical for the Allied forces in Europe. The answer they came up with wasn't just a solution. It was a legend in the making. This is the story of the Red Ball Express, the largest and most ambitious truck convoy system the world had ever seen. A story of grit, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to win a war. Picture this. It's August 1944. The D-Day landings were a success, and Allied armies, led by General Patton's Third Army, are charging across France at a breathtaking pace. They're chasing the German army, liberating towns and cities faster than anyone predicted. It's a moment of triumph, but a crisis is brewing just behind the front lines. The armies are moving so fast, they're literally outrunning their supplies. The advance is in danger of grinding to a halt, not because of enemy bullets, but because of empty fuel tanks and dwindling ammunition. The traditional supply methods just couldn't keep up. The French railway system, a primary target for Allied bombers before D-Day, was in ruins. The ports at Normandy, freshly captured, were overwhelmed and still being repaired. The soldiers at the front needed everything: gasoline, ammo, food, medical supplies. They were consuming over 20,000 tons of supplies per day, a staggering amount. The entire success of the push toward Germany hung in the balance. A bold, radical new plan was needed, and it was needed yesterday. So, on August 25, 1944, a new operation was born. It was codenamed the Red Ball Express. The name itself came from a railroad term. In the old days, when a train shipment was prioritized, it was marked with a red ball to ensure it got to its destination without delay. This new express route for trucks would operate under the same principle: absolute priority. This was no ordinary supply run. It was the very lifeline of the Allied advance. The plan was audacious. It called for a continuous 24/7 loop of trucks running from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the forward supply depots near Paris and beyond. To make this happen, the Army designated specific main roads exclusively for this purpose: one route for trucks heading to the front, and a parallel route for the empty trucks returning. These roads were marked with signs bearing a simple red circle on a yellow background. For any military personnel who saw that red ball symbol, the message was clear: get out of the way. These trucks had absolute right-of-way. No one, regardless of rank, was allowed to interfere with a Red Ball convoy. Now, who would drive these trucks, day and night, through treacherous conditions? The answer lay with a group of soldiers who would become the backbone of the entire operation. The vast majority of the drivers, about 75%, were African American soldiers. In a segregated army, these men were often relegated to service and support roles, denied the chance to fight in combat units. The Red Ball Express gave them a different, but equally vital, way to contribute to the war effort. They were handed the keys to the iconic GMC 2.5-ton truck, the workhorse of the U.S. Army, affectionately known as the Doucette. Suddenly, thousands of these trucks were mobilized. The scale was immense. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 vehicles, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Think about that for a moment. A non-stop river of steel flowing across the French countryside. The drivers worked in grueling shifts, often driving for more than 24 hours straight with little to no sleep. They faced constant danger. The roads were often in poor condition, damaged by fighting. They drove through blackouts at night to avoid being targets for the German Air Force. The Luft mechanical breakdowns were frequent, and drivers had to become expert mechanics on the fly, patching up their trucks to keep the convoy moving. They were under immense pressure. Speed was everything. The official speed limit was 25 miles per hour, but it was an open secret that drivers pushed their trucks much faster, often removing the governors on their engines to squeeze out every bit of power. They called themselves Red Ball chauffeurs, and they took immense pride in their mission. They knew that the soldiers on the front lines were counting on them for the fuel in their tanks and the bullets in their rifles. They were racing against time and against the enemy. The operation was a logistical masterpiece. Along the route, ordnance companies set up repair and maintenance stations. The Quartermaster Corps established depots for refueling the trucks and providing rations for the drivers. Military police were stationed at intersections to direct traffic and ensure the convoys kept moving. It was a massive, coordinated effort involving tens of thousands of personnel, all dedicated to a single goal: keeping the front line supplied. The Red Ball Express ran for 82 consecutive days, from late August until mid-November 1944. During that time, it delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. It was the critical factor that enabled the Allied armies to continue their rapid advance across France and into Belgium. Without the fuel, food, and ammunition delivered by those relentless drivers, Patton's tanks would have stopped dead in their tracks. The war in Europe could have dragged on for much longer. But the story of the Red Ball Express is more than just a story of logistics. It's a story of human endeavor. It's about the young men, many still in their teens, who found themselves behind the wheel of a heavy truck, carrying the weight of the war on their shoulders. They were often overlooked, their contributions not as glamorous as those of the infantryman or the fighter pilot. But their courage and dedication were just as real. They faced exhaustion, enemy snipers, and the constant threat of air attack. They navigated unfamiliar roads in the dead of night, fueled by caffeine and sheer determination. The contribution of the African American soldiers who formed the majority of the drivers is particularly significant. They performed their duty with excellence and professionalism, despite facing discrimination within their own army. Their performance on the Red Ball Express was a powerful demonstration of their capability and patriotism, and it played a role in the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military a few years after the war. They proved, beyond any doubt, that their skill and courage were second to none. By November 1944, the situation had changed. The port of Antwerp in Belgium was captured and opened to Allied shipping, providing a much closer and more efficient supply point. The French railway system was slowly being repaired. The urgent need for the massive truck convoys lessened, and the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. But its legend was already cemented. It had done its job. It had bridged the critical supply gap and fueled the liberation of France. Today, the Red Ball Express stands as a testament to American ingenuity and logistical prowess. It demonstrates how a critical problem, under the immense pressure of war, can be solved with creativity and unwavering determination. More than that, it's a tribute to the thousands of soldiers, especially the African American drivers, who made it all possible. They were the unsung heroes who worked in the shadows, the men who drove the lifeline of the Allied army. Their relentless effort ensured that the wheels of war kept turning, paving the road to victory. The next time you see footage of World War II tanks racing across Europe, remember the story of the Red Ball Express, the river of trucks, and the determined drivers who kept them moving. Have you ever heard of the Red Ball Express? It sounds like a train, right? But it was actually one of the most incredible, high-stakes trucking operations in history, and it was the lifeline for the Allied invasion of Europe after D-Day. What's even more incredible is who was behind the wheel. Imagine this. The year is 1944. Allied forces have broken through the German lines in Normandy and are racing across France. They're moving so fast that their supply lines can't keep up. Tanks are running out of fuel, soldiers are low on ammo, and the entire advance is in danger of grinding to a halt. The solution? A massive, non-stop truck convoy system that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This was the Red Ball Express. Now, here's the part of the story that often gets left out of the history books. According to Smithsonian Magazine and historical records, a staggering 75% of the drivers on this critical mission were African American soldiers. These men were serving in a segregated army, facing discrimination and prejudice both at home and within the military itself. They were often relegated to service and support roles, denied the chance to fight on the front lines alongside their white counterparts. Yet, when the call came for this crucial, back-breaking work, they stepped up and delivered in a way that literally changed the course of the war. The name Red Ball Express came from a railroad term for priority cargo, and make no mistake, this was the highest priority. The route was a one-way loop system on roads closed to civilian traffic. Trucks marked with a red ball were given absolute writ of void. Military police were stationed along the entire route to make sure nothing, and no one, stopped the convoy. The drivers were pushed to their absolute limits. They drove 4 days on end with minimal sleep, often navigating blacked-out roads at night to avoid being spotted by enemy aircraft. They'd grab a few hours of sleep in their trucks or in makeshift camps by the side of the road before getting right back behind the wheel. And the danger was constant. These weren't just long-haul truckers. They were soldiers driving through a war. They faced the threat of German ambushes, sniper fire, and air attacks from the Luftwaffe. They had to be mechanics as well as drivers, often performing hasty repairs on their trucks under the most stressful conditions imaginable. Sometimes, even under enemy fire. The roads were often in terrible condition, damaged by shelling and filled with debris. Breakdowns were common, and a single stalled truck could create a massive bottleneck, jeopardizing the entire supply chain. These men had to be resourceful, brave, and incredibly resilient. Think about the sheer scale of this operation. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved nearly 6,000 trucks, delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. That's fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies, everything needed to keep General Patton's Third Army and other Allied units pushing toward Germany. The famous General Patton himself said that the Red Ball Express was his most vital logistical element. Without it, the rapid advance across France would have been impossible. The speed of the Allied push caught the German High Command completely off guard, and that was thanks in large part to the relentless pace set by these drivers. Despite their heroic efforts, the story of these African-American soldiers was largely overlooked for decades. They performed one of the most dangerous and essential jobs in the European theater, all while dealing with the injustice of segregation. They weren't just fighting a war against the Axis powers. They were fighting a battle for respect and equality within their own ranks. Their commanders, seeing their incredible performance, knew their value. Some officers even began to question the logic of segregation, seeing firsthand that skill and bravery had no color. The success of the Red Ball Express was a powerful, undeniable demonstration of the capabilities of these soldiers. The operation officially ran for 82 days, from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. In that short time, the drivers of the Red Ball Express transported over 412,000 tons of supplies. It was a logistical miracle born out of desperation and executed with incredible courage and determination. The contributions of these African American soldiers were not just important. They were fundamental to the Allied victory in Europe. They proved that, when given the opportunity, they could perform as well as, or even better than, any other unit. Their dedication paved the way, not just for the Allied armies in France, but for the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military a few years later. So, the next time you read about the Allied push across Europe after D-Day, remember the rumble of the GMC Jimmy trucks. Remember the red balls painted on their bumpers, signaling their vital mission. And most importantly, Remember the thousands of African American soldiers who were the backbone of the Red Ball Express. They were the unsung heroes who drove day and night through danger and exhaustion to fuel the engine of victory. Their legacy is a powerful story of perseverance, skill, and patriotism in the face of adversity. They didn't just deliver supplies, they delivered a crucial blow to the enemy and a powerful statement in the fight for equality. It's late summer 1944. The D-Day landings were a success, and Allied forces have broken out of Normandy. General George S. Patton's Third Army is racing across France, moving so fast that they're outrunning their own supply lines. Tanks are thirsty for fuel, guns are hungry for ammunition, and soldiers are desperate for food. Without these essentials, the entire Allied war machine would grind to a screeching halt, giving the German army precious time to regroup and counterattack. The situation was critical. Enter the Red Ball Express. This wasn't some fancy high-speed train. It was a massive, non-stop truck convoy system, a lifeline stretching for hundreds of miles, created in a desperate effort to solve this logistical nightmare. The name Red Ball was an old railroad term for priority freight, and that's exactly what this was. Top priority, round-the-clock deliveries to the front lines. The plan was audacious. They designated a one-way loop of roads exclusively for the convoys. One route for trucks heading to the front, another for them to return. Civilian traffic was banned, and military police lined the route to keep things moving. Now, who were the drivers of this incredible operation? The overwhelming majority, about 75%, were African American soldiers. At a time when the U.S. military was still segregated, these men were often relegated to service and support roles, far from the frontline glory. But the Red Ball Express put them at the very heart of the Allied war effort. They were tasked with a mission that was just as dangerous and just as vital as any combat role. These drivers faced incredible challenges. They drove day and night, in all weather conditions, often with little to no sleep. They pushed their 2.5-ton GMC trucks, affectionately nicknamed Jimmies, to their absolute limits. Breakdowns were constant. The roads were often narrow, damaged by battle, and congested. Drivers had to be their own mechanics, patching up tires and fixing engines on the fly to keep the convoy rolling, and the danger was ever present. They were a prime target for the German Luftwaffe, which would strafe the columns from the air. Snipers also lurked along the routes, picking off drivers. There were no front lines here. Danger was everywhere. Let's talk about the sheer scale of this operation. It's almost impossible to comprehend. At its peak, the Red Bull Express was operating nearly 6,000 trucks at any given moment. Imagine a continuous stream of trucks, bumper to bumper, stretching for miles and miles, all hurtling towards the front. The numbers are staggering. Official U.S. Army records show that, at its height, the Express delivered a mind-blowing 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. That's 12,500 tons of fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies, everything needed to sustain a modern army on the move. To put that into perspective, General Patton's entire Third Army, famous for its lightning-fast armored advances, was completely dependent on these deliveries. His Sherman tanks couldn't roll without the gasoline they brought. His artillery couldn't fire without the shells they carried. His infantry couldn't fight without the food and ammunition that arrived on the back of these trucks. Patton himself, a man not known for handing out praise lightly, acknowledged the critical importance of the Red Ball Express. He knew that without this relentless river of supplies, his legendary race across France would have been a short walk. The drivers worked in grueling shifts. Many drove for more than 48 hours straight, powered by caffeine and sheer determination. They developed a rule. One driver would sleep in the passenger seat, while the other drove, swapping places without ever stopping the truck. They marked their routes with red balls painted on signs, and MPs were stationed at every intersection to wave them through, shouting, "Keep 'em rollin'." This became their unofficial motto, a testament to their relentless pace. The pressure was immense. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammo, was desperately needed at the front. A delay could mean the difference between victory and defeat in a crucial battle. The operation ran for 82 days, from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. During that time, the Red Ball Express transported over 412,000 tons of supplies. It was an unprecedented logistical achievement, one that had never been attempted on this scale before. It was a messy, exhausting, and dangerous job, but it was absolutely essential. The success of the Red Ball Express allowed the Allies to maintain their momentum after the Normandy breakout, pushing the German army back towards its own border and preventing them from establishing a new, solid defensive line in France. However, the story of the Red Ball Express is more than just numbers and tonnage. It's a story of human endurance and quiet heroism. It's the story of those African-American soldiers who answered the call. They faced discrimination at home and segregation in the army, yet they performed their duty with incredible professionalism and courage. They weren't fighting for medals or headlines. They were fighting to win the war. And they did it by taking on one of the toughest, most grueling jobs imaginable. Their contribution was just as crucial as that of the soldiers in the trenches. By mid-November, the situation had changed. The port of Antwerp in Belgium was captured and opened to Allied shipping, and rail lines were repaired. This created a much more efficient way to get supplies to the front. The need for the massive, long-haul truck convoy system diminished, and the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. The trucks and their drivers were reassigned to other duties. But for those 82 intense days, they were the lifeblood of the Allied armies in Western Europe. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is twofold. From a military perspective, it was a masterclass in improvisation and logistics. It demonstrated how a determined force could overcome seemingly insurmountable supply challenges. It became a model for future military logistical operations. But perhaps more importantly, its legacy lies in the story of the men who made it happen. The performance of these African-American soldiers under extreme pressure was a powerful argument against segregation. It proved, beyond any doubt, their skill, dedication, and patriotism, and it played a role in the eventual desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces a few years later. So, the next time you read about Patton's daring armored thrusts or the rapid Allied advance across France, remember the Red Ball Express. Remember the thousands of drivers working in the shadows who made it all possible. Remember the constant drone of engines, the endless roads, and the 12,500 tons of supplies they moved every single day. They were the unsung heroes who truly kept the wheels of victory turning. As the Allies surged across France in the summer of 1944, German High Command knew that if they could sever this lifeline, they could halt the Allied advance in its tracks. Their strategy wasn't about grand, decisive battles. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, a relentless campaign of harassment, ambush, and attrition designed to bleed the Red Ball Express dry. They threw everything they had at it. Elite snipers, devastating anti-tank mines, surprise air raids from the Luftwaffe, and highly mobile battle-hardened units that would strike like lightning and vanish back into the French countryside. The German plan was cunning. They understood they couldn't win a head-on fight against the overwhelming Allied forces. Instead, they focused on creating chaos and fear. Imagine you're a young driver, maybe only 18 or 19 years old, pushing your 2.5-ton truck down a narrow, dusty road in rural France. You've been driving for hours. You're exhausted, and your eyes are straining in the dim light. Suddenly, a crack echoes from the tree line. The truck in front of you swerves violently as its tire explodes. The driver hit by a sniper's bullet. This was the reality for the men of the Red Ball Express. German snipers, often veterans of the Eastern Front, would hide for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their targets weren't just the drivers. They aimed for engines, radiators, and tires. Anything to disable a truck and create a bottleneck. A single disabled truck could back up a convoy for miles, making it a sitting duck for further attacks. Then there were the mines. German engineers became masters of camouflage, laying teller mines and other anti-tank devices in the most unexpected places. They'd hide them in potholes, bury them under fresh patches of dirt on the roadside, or even place them in the debris of a previously destroyed vehicle. For the drivers, every bump in the road, every strange object, was a potential threat. It was a nerve-wracking ordeal. Allied engineers worked around the clock to clear these routes, but the Germans were just as quick to lay new ones. It was a deadly cat-and-mouse game played out on hundreds of miles of French roads. Each cleared road was a victory. But the threat was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. And from the skies came the Luftwaffe. While the Allies largely controlled the air, The German Air Force could still muster small, surgical strikes. Fighters like the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, armed with cannons and bombs, would scream down on the long, exposed columns of trucks. They'd target major intersections, bridges, and fuel depots, hoping to cause maximum disruption. A successful air raid could destroy dozens of trucks in a matter of seconds, creating massive fireballs and sending plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky. For the drivers on the ground, the sound of an approaching engine could mean friend or foe, and the seconds spent scanning the sky were filled with dread. These raids, though not constant, were a terrifying reminder that nowhere was truly safe. Perhaps the most effective German tactic was the use of small, mobile combat groups, known as Kampftruppen. These weren't massive divisions, but rather agile, combat arms units. They might consist of a few tanks or assault guns, some armored half-tracks filled with infantry, and anti-tank weapons. These groups would use their knowledge of the local terrain to set up devastating ambushes. They'd wait in a dense forest or behind a small village, letting the lead elements of a convoy pass before opening up with a torrent of fire on the softer, more vulnerable supply trucks in the middle. The goal was to cause panic, inflict casualties, and destroy as much materiel as possible before Allied combat units could respond. Once they had struck, they would melt away, using backwards and hidden paths to avoid pursuit, only to reappear miles away to strike another convoy. So, with all this pressured the snipers, the mines, the air raids, and the ambush. How on earth did the Red Ball Express survive? Why did Germany's hit-and-run strategy ultimately fail to stop the flow of supplies? The answer lies in three key factors: sheer volume, relentless repair, and iron-willed discipline. First, let's talk about volume. The scale of the Red Ball Express was simply staggering. On any given day, thousands of trucks were on the road. The Germans might successfully ambush a convoy and destroy 10 or 20 trucks, but that was just a tiny fraction of the total. For every truck they destroyed, 100 more got through. The Red Ball Express wasn't a single artery. It was a massive network of capillaries. Trying to shut it down with small-scale attacks was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The sheer, overwhelming number of trucks moving around the clock meant that losses, while tragic, were statistically acceptable from a strategic perspective. The supply chain was designed to absorb these hits and keep moving. Next was the incredible work of the engineers. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were the unsung heroes of this operation. When a road was mined, they were there, sweeping and clearing. When a bridge was blown, they would construct a temporary pontoon bridge, often in a matter of hours. Roads cratered by bombs were filled and paved over almost as soon as the dust settled. They worked tirelessly, often under fire, to keep the routes open. German saboteurs would work all night to disable a key road, only to find it fully operational again by morning. These constant, rapid repair work completely neutralized Germany's attempts to create long-term blockages. The Red Ball Express simply routed around the problem or waited briefly while the engineers worked their magic. Finally, and most importantly, was the traffic control and the unbreakable spirit of the drivers. The operation was managed with military precision. The routes were one-way loops to prevent traffic jams. Convoys were dispatched at regular intervals, and strict speed limits were enforced to maintain spacing. Military police were stationed at every major intersection, directing traffic and keeping things moving. This tight control prevented the chaos the Germans hoped to create. Even when a truck was hit, drivers were under orders to not stop. Unless your own vehicle was disabled, you kept going. You pushed past the burning wreck, you kept your eyes on the road, and you drove on. This incredible discipline, this refusal to panic, was the ultimate counter to Germany's strategy of fear. The drivers, predominantly African-American soldiers, faced not only the enemy, but also systemic discrimination. Yet they performed their duty with a courage and determination that was simply astonishing. In the end, Germany's guerrilla-style war against the Red Ball Express was a failure. It caused casualties, it destroyed equipment, and it certainly made life hell for the drivers, but it never came close to stopping the torrent of supplies. The combination of overwhelming scale, engineering, ingenuity, and the resolute bravery of the men behind the wheel made the Red Ball Express an unstoppable force. It was a logistical triumph that proved that in modern warfare, the battle for supply lines is just as critical as the battle on the front lines. The hit-and-run tactics were a nuisance, a deadly and terrifying nuisance. But they could not break the back of this incredible operation. 1944. The Allies have landed in Normandy. Operation Overlord is a success, but a new, colossal challenge looms. The beaches are secured, but the heart of France, and ultimately Germany, lies hundreds of miles away. How do you supply a million-man army on the move? An army that consumes 700 tons of supplies every single day. The answer was a logistical nightmare. Allied bombing, which had been so crucial in paving the way for the invasion, had also systematically obliterated France's infrastructure. Railways were a tangled mess of twisted steel. Major ports like Cherbourg and La Hara, vital gateways for supplies, were either still in German hands or had been rendered completely unusable. Their harbors choked with mines and wreckage. The Allied advance was in danger of grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but from starvation of fuel, ammunition, and food. The very success of the D-Day landings was at risk of becoming a strategic failure. General Eisenhower and his planners were facing a crisis, the brilliant breakout from the Normandy beaches, led by General Patton's Third Army, was moving so fast that supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Tanks were running out of gas, artillery units were rationing shells, and soldiers were short on rations. The army was outrunning its own lifeline. A radical, unprecedented solution was needed, and it needed to be implemented yesterday. In this moment of extreme pressure, a plan was born out of desperation and ingenuity. It wasn't a complex feat of engineering or a secret weapon. It was something much more fundamental. A trucking route. But this wouldn't be just any trucking route. This would be a massive, non-stop, one-way loop of trucks, running day and night, dedicated solely to keeping the front lines supplied. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from an old railroad term for prioritized freight, and this freight was the most important in the world. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, this Red Ball Highway became the lifeblood of the Allied armies in France. The route was a closed loop, stretching over 600 miles from the beaches of Normandy to the rapidly advancing front lines near Paris and beyond. On one set of roads, trucks drove exclusively east, fully loaded. On another, they returned west, empty, to reload. Civilian traffic was banned. Military units were forbidden from using the roads unless they were part of the convoy. The route was marked with red ball symbols, guiding drivers who often didn't know the local language or landscape. The scale of this operation was staggering. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Think about that for a moment. That's the equivalent weight of 2 Eiffel Towers in supplies delivered daily. These weren't leisurely drives. The trucks were pushed to their limits, often carrying double their intended loads. Drivers were on the road for grueling stretches, sometimes driving for more than 24 hours straight, with only short naps and coffee to keep them going. Maintenance was done on the fly, with mechanics working around the clock in makeshift depots along the route to fix flats, repair engines, and get trucks back on the road as quickly as possible. And who were the heroes behind the wheel of these trucks? The unsung drivers of the Red Ball Express. Critically, about 75% of them were African American soldiers, at a time when the U.S. military was still segregated. These men were often relegated to service and support roles rather than combat. Yet, their contribution was anything but secondary. They faced immense challenges: exhaustion, the constant threat of German snipers and ambushes, and the ever-present danger of mechanical failure on roads littered with the debris of war. They worked under a cloud of racial prejudice, yet they performed their duties with incredible determination and patriotism. These soldiers knew the stakes. They knew that every gallon of gasoline they delivered was for a Sherman tank on the verge of running dry. Every crate of ammunition was for a machine gun nest holding a critical position. Every ration was for a hungry soldier on the front line. Their unofficial motto was, "Keep 'em rolling," and they lived it every single minute of their grueling shifts. Many of these drivers had never driven a heavy truck before joining the army, but they learned fast, navigating narrow, war-torn roads in all weather conditions, often driving through the night with their headlights blacked out to avoid being targeted by the Luftwaffe. The Red Ball Express was a testament to improvisation. Military police lined the entire route, acting as traffic cops to keep the convoy moving, waving trucks through intersections without stopping. There were no speed limits. The only rule was to keep a 60-yard distance from the truck in front and never, ever stop. If a truck broke down, the driver was instructed to pull it to the side of the road so it wouldn't block the endless flow of traffic behind it. A repair crew would come along later. The priority was the momentum of the whole system. As the New York Times would later analyze, the Red Ball Express was a logistical miracle. It proved that a flexible, rapidly improvised supply chain could be more effective than the enemy's most calculated strategies. While the German army was still relying heavily on horse-drawn carts and damaged rail lines, the Allies were demonstrating the overwhelming power of American industrial might and sheer logistical willpower. General Patton himself, famous for his aggressive tactics, acknowledged that his army's rapid advance across France would have been completely impossible without the relentless flow of supplies from the Red Ball Express. The operation was only meant to be a temporary emergency fix, lasting just a few weeks until the port of Antwerp could be captured and cleared, but it ran for 82 brutal, non-stop days. In that time, the men of the Red Ball Express transported over 400,000 tons of supplies. They were the critical link that connected the factories of America to the foxholes of the front line. When the Express finally ceased operations on November 16, 1944, the Allies had secured major ports and begun repairing the rail networks, creating a more sustainable supply line. But the legacy of the Red Ball Express was already cemented. It was a story of ordinary people achieving the extraordinary under the most intense pressure imaginable. It was a gritty, unglamorous, and absolutely vital chapter of the Allied victory. So, the next time you think about the great battles of World War II, the famous generals, and the acts of battlefield heroism, remember the drivers of the Red Ball Express. Remember the thousands of men who fought the war not with a rifle, but with a steering wheel and a gas pedal, racing against time on a highway of red balls, fueling the fire of liberation. Their relentless drive and sacrifice proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in an army's arsenal is a simple truck, a full tank of gas, and the unbreakable will to keep moving forward. Picture this: August 1944. The Allies have broken out of Normandy, and General Georges Patton's Third Army is a spearhead of steel, racing across France. It's a breathtaking advance, a lightning war that would become legendary. But this legendary speed wasn't just about bold tactics or brave soldiers. It was powered by something far more fundamental: gasoline. And getting that gasoline to the front lines was one of the most incredible logistical feats of World War II, an operation known as the Red Ball Express. After the D-Day landings, the Allies faced a massive problem. They had landed millions of men and mountains of supplies on the beaches, but the French railway system, a primary target of pre-invasion bombing, was in ruins. Ports like Cherbourg were heavily damaged. As Patton's tanks and trucks pushed deeper into France, they stretched their supply lines to the breaking point. An armored division could burn through 350,000 gallons of fuel a day, and Patton had multiple divisions on the move. Without fuel, the entire Allied advance would grind to a halt. The German army, retreating but not broken, would have time to regroup, dig in, and turn the liberation of Europe into a bloody, protracted stalemate. The solution was audacious and unprecedented. On August 25, 1944, the U.S. Army launched the Red Ball Express. The name came from a railroad term for priority cargo. This was a massive, non-stop truck convoy system that ran on a one-way loop of roads closed to all other traffic. For 83 intense days, from late August until mid-November, this lifeline of trucks operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in all weather, to keep the front lines supplied. Now, who were the heroes behind the wheel of these trucks? The overwhelming majority, about 75%, were African American soldiers. At a time when the U.S. military was still segregated, these men were often relegated to service and support roles. But on the Red Ball Express, they became the lifeblood of the Allied war machine. They faced grueling conditions, driving for hours on end with little sleep, often under the threat of German aircraft or sniper fire. They had to deal with mechanical breakdowns, poor road conditions, and the immense pressure of knowing that an entire army was depending on them. These drivers weren't just hauling cargo. They were delivering victory. Let's really get into the scale of this operation. At its peak, The Red Ball Express utilized nearly 6,000 trucks and was moving over 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The main route stretched from the Normandy beaches all the way to the front lines near Paris and eventually to the German border. Imagine a constant stream of 2.5-ton GMC trucks, affectionately nicknamed Jimmies, rumbling down French country roads, day and night. To keep the trucks moving, drivers were often paired up, one driving while the other slept. They pushed their vehicles and themselves to the absolute limit. Red ball markers were posted along the route to guide drivers who might be delirious from exhaustion. Maintenance crews worked around the clock in makeshift depots to repair breakdowns and keep the fleet rolling. This brings us back to General Patton. Patton was a brilliant, aggressive commander, but he was also a pragmatist. He understood logistics better than almost anyone. He knew his lightning drive was entirely dependent on a steady flow of fuel and ammunition. Historians from the National Archives confirm that Patton's legendary speed through northern France and Belgium depended entirely on these Red Ball fuel deliveries. His armored divisions were thirsty beasts, burning thousands of gallons of gasoline every single day. There's a famous and very Patton-esque quote attributed to him during this time. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." It's a stark, brutal assessment, but it captures the reality of mechanized warfare. The Red Bull Express ensured his tanks, and the tanks of the entire First and Third Armies, never ran dry at a critical moment. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were under no illusions about the importance of their mission. They knew that every can of gasoline, every box of ammunition, every food ration they delivered was crucial. They faced constant danger. German fighter planes, the Luftwaffe, would strafe the convoys. Snipers sometimes took potshots from the woods. The roads were often narrow, damaged, and clogged with military traffic and French refugees, despite being officially closed. Accidents were common, especially at night when drivers used cat's eye blackout lights, which were little more than tiny slits of light, to avoid being spotted from the air. The physical and mental toll was immense, yet they kept driving. Their contribution was not just about logistics, it was a powerful statement. These African-American soldiers, serving in a segregated army, proved their courage, dedication, and skill beyond any doubt. Their performance on the Red Ball Express was a major factor in the post-war debate over desegregating the military, which finally happened in 1948. They demonstrated that patriotism and capability have no color. They were fighting two wars, one against the Axis powers in Europe, and another against prejudice and inequality within their own ranks. And in the fields of France, behind the wheels of their rumbling trucks, they were winning both. The Red Bull Express officially ended on November 16, 1944. By then, the port of Antwerp in Belgium had been opened, and the Allied forces had repaired enough of the French railway system to take over the main burden of supply. The 83-day run was over, but its legacy is undeniable. Without the Red Bull Express, the rapid Allied advance across France in the summer and fall of 1944 would have been impossible. The war in Europe might have dragged on for many more months, costing countless more lives. It was a triumph of logistics, innovation, and sheer human endurance. Today, when we study the great battles and brilliant generals of World War II, it's easy to overlook the gritty, unglamorous work that made it all possible. But the story of the Red Bull Express is a powerful reminder that wars are won not just by generals and frontline soldiers, but by the mechanics, the quartermasters, and the truck drivers who form the backbone of the army. It's the story of thousands of unsung heroes, mostly young African-American men, who answered the call of duty and delivered the fuel for victory, one truckload at a time. They were the engine of liberation, the true force behind Patton's lightning. After the dramatic D-Day landings in June 1944, the Allies made stunning progress. They broke out of the Normandy hedgerows and started a lightning-fast advance across France. Paris was liberated in August, and Allied forces were racing towards the German border. It seemed like the war could be over by Christmas. But this rapid advance created a massive, potentially catastrophic problem. Supplies. Think about it. An army, as Napoleon famously said, marches on its stomach. But it's not just food. It's fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, everything. The Allied spearheads were moving so fast they were literally outrunning their supply lines. The main ports, like Cherbourg, had been heavily damaged by the retreating Germans. The French railway system was a wreck, deliberately sabotaged by the French resistance and Allied bombers to hinder the Germans. Suddenly, the most powerful military force ever assembled was grinding to a halt, not because of enemy action, but because it was running out of gas. This was the moment of crisis. General Pétion's Third Army, famous for its aggressive high-speed advances, was sometimes consuming over 400,000 gallons of gasoline a day. At one point, they were so desperate for fuel that they were using captured German stocks and even resorting to siphoning gas from other vehicles. The momentum was being lost, and this gave the Germans a desperately needed breather. It allowed them to regroup, dig in, and prepare to defend their homeland. If the Allies couldn't solve this supply nightmare, the war could drag on for much longer, costing countless more lives. Enter the Red Ball Express. This was an emergency, around-the-clock truck convoy system designed to bridge the gap. The name Red Ball came from a railroad term for priority freight, and priority it was. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, a continuous loop of trucks ran day and night, carrying supplies from the Normandy beaches all the way to the front lines near the German border. This wasn't just a few trucks. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved nearly 6,000 vehicles, delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The main routes were one-way roads, closed to all other civilian and military traffic. Outgoing trucks, loaded to the brim, took the northern route, while returning empty trucks used the southern route. It was a non-stop, 24/7 operation. Now, here's the part of the story that is both heroic and deeply significant. The vast majority of the drivers, about 75%, were African-American soldiers. In a segregated army, these men were often relegated to service and support roles, denied the chance to serve in combat units. But here, on the roads of France, they became the lifeblood of the Allied advance. These drivers faced incredible challenges. They drove for hours on end, often with little sleep, on roads that were dusty, muddy, and sometimes still under threat from leftover German snipers or Luftwaffe planes. The trucks were pushed to their limits, frequently breaking down. Drivers had to be skilled not just at driving, but at making quick roadside repairs. They were armed with a rifle and a helmet, and they knew the importance of their mission. They weren't just driving trucks, they were driving victory. There are countless stories of their dedication. Drivers who would stay behind the wheel for 48 hours straight, grabbing a few minutes of sleep while another truck was being loaded. Mechanics working miracles to keep the worn-out vehicles running. Military police lining the routes to keep traffic moving, and guide drivers who were literally falling asleep at the wheel. It was a display of endurance and determination on an industrial scale. The impact was immediate and decisive. Thanks to the Red Ball Express, the Allied supply crisis was averted. The tanks started rolling again. The artillery had shells to fire. The soldiers had food to eat. The momentum was regained. By the time the operation ended in November, new ports like Antwerp were opened, and the railway system was being repaired, allowing for more conventional supply methods. But for those crucial 82 days, the Red Ball Express was the lifeline. It allowed the Allies to maintain relentless pressure on the German forces, pushing them back to the Siegfried Line, Germany's western border defense. It ensured that when the Germans launched their last-ditch counteroffensive in the Ardennes, what we know as the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied forces were well and able to withstand the initial shock and ultimately crush the attack. BBC military analysts have since called the Red Ball Express the greatest logistical triumph of modern warfare. And they're right. Without it, the history of late 1944 could have looked very different. The Allied advance might have stalled completely, giving the German war machine precious time to recover and strengthen its defenses. The war in Europe could have extended well into 1945, or even longer. Germany's failure to sever these supply lines, their inability to stop this relentless river of mud, meant that their last hopes of fighting the Allies to a standstill on the Western Front vanished. Once the logistical crisis was solved, there was no stopping the Allied juggernaut. It was a turning point that proved, once again, that wars are won not just by brave soldiers on the front line, but by the equally heroic efforts of those who support them from behind. The story of the Red Ball Express is a testament to ingenuity, endurance, and the unglamorous but absolutely vital role of logistics in warfare. It's also a powerful chapter in the history of African American soldiers in World War II who proved their patriotism and skill in a way that directly contributed to the downfall of the Third Reich. Their contribution was indispensable. So next time you read about the race across France and the final push into Germany, remember the unsung heroes of the Red Ball Express. Remember the thousands of drivers who, day and night, rain or shine, kept the wheels of victory turning. They didn't just deliver supplies, they delivered the final defeat of Nazi Germany. What wins? Wars. Tanks. Planes. Brave soldiers. Absolutely. But there's a hidden hero, a force so powerful it can bring an entire army to its knees, or propel it to victory. It's called logistics. And in the final stretch of World War II, one logistical operation became a legend, a lifeline that crushed Germany's hopes and sped up the end of the conflict. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. The year is 1944. Following the D-Day landings, Allied forces are storming across France. It's a blitzkrieg, in reverse, moving so fast, they're outrunning their own supply lines. Tanks are running dry, soldiers are low on ammo, and the entire offensive is grinding to a halt. The problem wasn't a lack of supplies, but how to get them from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines hundreds of miles away. The French railway system was shattered, bombed by the Allies themselves to cripple German movement. A new solution was needed, and fast. The answer was audacious. A massive, one-way, non-stop truck convoy system. They called it the Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from an old railroad term for priority shipments. This wasn't just a few trucks. It was a colossal undertaking. The U.S. Army commandeered every available truck they could find, from heavy-duty GMC Doosan de Halfs to smaller vehicles. They designated a closed loop of highways, one for the trip to the front and another for the return journey, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, who would drive these trucks? The call went out, and the vast majority of the drivers, about 75%, were African American soldiers. In a segregated army, these men were often relegated to service and support roles, far from the front lines. But the Red Ball Express put them right at the heart of the war effort. They were the lifeblood of the Allied advance. These drivers, many of whom had just learned to handle a heavy truck, were thrown into an relentless, high-stakes race against time. The conditions were brutal. They drove day and night through rain, mud, and darkness. To maintain speed, they were ordered to keep a steady 60 yards between trucks and travel at no more than 25 miles per hour. But the pressure was immense. Drivers often pushed their vehicles to the limit, earning them the nickname the Gasoline Cowboys. They faced exhaustion, mechanical failures, and the constant threat of German snipers or aircraft. Sleep was a luxury. Drivers would take turns, one catching a nap while the other drove. They'd pull over for 10-minute maintenance checks. But otherwise, the wheels never stopped turning. Imagine this: a continuous river of nearly 6,000 trucks, hauling everything from gasoline and ammunition to food and medical supplies. Roads were marked with red balls to guide the drivers, who were forbidden from stopping. If a truck broke down, a repair crew would rush to fix it or pull it aside so the convoy could keep moving. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies to the front lines every single day. That's the weight of 2 Eiffel Towers in supplies, delivered daily. This incredible feat of logistics had a direct and decisive impact on the war. It was the Red Ball Express that fueled General Patton's Third Army as it raced across France. Without this constant flow of supplies, the liberation of Paris, the push into Belgium, and the eventual invasion of Germany itself would have been impossible. The Allied commanders knew it. General Eisenhower himself recognized the critical role of the operation. The Germans, who were masters of logistics themselves, were baffled by the Allies' ability to sustain such a rapid advance. The Red Ball Express ran for 83 days. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, It officially ended when the port of Antwerp in Belgium was opened, allowing supplies to be brought in much closer to the front. But in those crucial 3 months, the Express had become a legend. It was a testament to ingenuity, determination, and the sheer grit of the thousands of men who drove those routes. More than just a logistical triumph, the Red Ball Express also highlighted the invaluable contribution of African American soldiers. These men proved their courage and capability under extreme pressure, challenging the racial prejudices of the time. While full integration of the U.S. military was still years away, their performance on the Red Ball route was a powerful argument for equality and a significant step forward. So, when we think about the turning points of World War II, let's remember the Red Ball Express. It wasn't a battle fought with guns, but with gears, gasoline, and guts. It proved an age-old military maxim: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The non-stop river of trucks, driven by unsung heroes, was one of the key weapons that brought the war in Europe to a faster conclusion. It was the highway to victory.